Hey guys, gather round the digital campfire because tonight we're diving headfirst into the lives of a special breed men who wrestled with Mother Nature for a living, and sometimes she wrestled back, and took a finger or two as a souvenir. I'm talking about mountain men. These were the grizzled, half-wild trappers and wanderers who carved out a life in the frozen heart of North America way back when central heating was just a twinkle in some inventor's eye, and sound decision-making wasn't exactly a common trait. So, before you settle in too comfortably, take a second to give that like button a good whack and hit subscribe if you're digging what I'm doing here. But only if you genuinely dig it, alright? And definitely drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always mind-blowing to see the global crew we've got tuning in. Now, let's get one thing straight, the mountain men weren't exactly saints or heroes. They were just the kind of folks who looked at the edge of the map and thought, hey, I wonder what's past that? Probably a terrible idea, but let's check it out. Most of them were either farmers who couldn't quite make it work, restless veterans itching for a different kind of fight, or simply men who'd worn out their welcome with pretty much everyone they knew. Civilization, with all its rules and noise, just wasn't their cup of tea. So, they packed up their questionable life choices, pointed themselves west, and walked straight into the teeth of winter. They drifted westward in the early 1800s, drawn by the allure of the fur trade and the promise of getting rich quick. Of course, rich usually meant managing not to starve to death while chasing beavers through snow that was up to your waist. The job description was pretty straightforward. Spend 6 months or so in the mountains, come down with a healthy dose of frostbite, and maybe, just maybe, haul back something valuable enough to sell. And in a very real sense, they were. Out there in the mountains, philosophy wasn't about abstract ideas or intellectual debates. It was about sheer endurance, about finding the strength to keep going when everything inside you was screaming for you to stop. You didn't sit around debating the meaning of life. You debated whether or not your fingers still worked well enough to reload your rifle. Enlightenment wasn't some profound spiritual awakening. It was a dry pair of socks and a belly full of food. The fire didn't solve their problems, or magically erase the hardship of their existence. It just reminded them that they still had some problems left to solve, that they were still alive and capable of fighting for another day. But in that small circle of heat and flickering light, the universe made a brief, smoky kind of sense. And sometimes that was enough. For the mountain men, sleep wasn't a restful escape, a chance to recharge their batteries. It was a temporary truce with death, a risky gamble that they took every single night. You didn't go to bed in any conventional sense of the term. You just stopped moving for a few hours and hoped that nothing large, hungry, or exceedingly cold decided to interrupt your slumber. They slept in caves, under the overhanging branches of trees, or even buried in snow like oversized, hibernating rodents. If you were lucky enough to have a fur blanket, you considered yourself blessed. If you somehow managed to possess 2 fur blankets, you were probably sharing them with a colony of fleas that had been there far longer than you had. There were no pillows, no tents, and absolutely no such thing as comfort. Comfort was for people who could afford to be warm without having to earn it through sheer willpower and grit. The fire was your roommate, your unreliable and often inconsiderate companion for the night. They didn't freak out when things went wrong. Things always went wrong. You just fixed them or froze. They didn't call it resilience. They called it Tuesday. And they didn't complain because nobody was listening, which, when you think about it, is probably why they got so much done. We forgot the difference between comfort and capability. We've built a world where survival depends on Wi-Fi, food delivery apps, and getting outraged online. The mountain men depended on friction, animal fat, and fire. They worked for every meal, every degree of warmth, every breath of air that didn't freeze inside their lungs. The cold stripped them down until all that was left was the truth. You're not in control. You never were. Nature just occasionally lets you think you are. They didn't romanticize hardship. They didn't call it the simple life. It wasn't simple. It was brutal, lonely, and indifferent. But it was real. What we forgot is that comfort doesn't build strength. It replaces it. The mountain men knew that cold was life's default setting. Everything warm, safe, or easy was temporary, a privilege. And when the fire went out and the frost came creeping back, they didn't curse the cold. They just pulled the blanket tighter and said, "Figures, that's just how it is." That's not despair. That's wisdom. By the mid-1800s, the age of the mountain men started melting away like the snow they'd lived under for decades. The fur trade collapsed. Civilization crept west, bringing railroads, telegraphs, and too many people who thought frostbite was just a tall tale. The wilderness was shrinking, and so were the men who'd built their lives inside it. They didn't all die at once. They just faded. Some became guides for settlers, muttering warnings that nobody listened to. Others opened trading posts and spent their final winters selling overpriced coffee to people who called it adventure. When we envision medieval food today, our minds often conjure up images of something crude and unrefined. Greasy meat, bland bread, and hygiene practices that leave much to be desired. However, hidden beneath the layers of soot and superstition lay the very foundations of modern European cuisine. The medieval kitchen did not simply vanish with the arrival of the Renaissance. Instead, it evolved, leaving indelible traces in every spice rack, every traditional Sunday roast, and every lingering superstition about what we should or should not consume. The medieval obsession with balancing humors laid the groundwork for the concept of balanced diets. Physicians, such as Hildegard of Bingen, wrote extensively about the moral and medicinal properties of various foods, foreshadowing the field of nutritional science that we take for granted today. The art of sauce making, with its delicate balance of sweetness, acidity, and spice, provided the initial building blocks for French haute cuisine centuries later. Even the medieval custom of pairing meat with fruit and sweet glazes survives in contemporary dishes, such as glazed ham or cranberry sauce served at Christmas dinner. The spice trade, once the very heartbeat of medieval luxury, profoundly shaped global economics and exploration. Columbus's ill-fated shortcut to India was driven by the insatiable demand for spices. Venetian merchants, North African traders, and Arab navigators all owed their immense fortunes to the same humble ingredients that once perfumed a simple medieval stew. Pepper built empires, cinnamon inspired epic voyages, and nutmeg had the power to ignite wars. Even dining etiquette has its roots in this smoky past. The shared trencher gradually evolved into the individual plate. The practice of hand-washing before meals gave way to the use of napkins and cutlery, and the communal hall transformed into the private dining room. Grandier, gaunt and broken from days of relentless torture, was brought out in chains, his body a testament to the brutality he had endured. His legs were crushed, his body bruised and battered, yet his face remained eerily composed, a mask of stoic defiance that unnerved some of the onlookers. Eyewitnesses said that he looked more like a martyr than a sorcerer, his quiet dignity a stark contrast to the spectacle of hate that surrounded him. The executioners offered him one final chance to confess, to beg for forgiveness, and to name any accomplices who had aided him in his supposed crimes. He steadfastly refused, his voice ringing out with unwavering conviction. Instead, he prayed aloud for mercy on those who were condemning him to death, insisting that his soul was innocent even if his body was about to be destroyed. His words a final act of defiance against the injustice he was facing. Before the flames were lit, one of the exorcists, Father Lactance, attempted to bless the fire, shouting commands for the demons to depart, hoping to cleanse the execution from any trace of evil. But according to some accounts, he died screaming a few weeks later, succumbing to a mysterious illness as if cursed by the very act of blessing the fire that consumed an innocent man. His demise a chilling reminder of the potential consequences of participating in such a dark act. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the priest's robes caught fire, the flames quickly engulfing his body and sending plumes of black smoke curling into the sky like incense, a macabre offering to the heavens. Some claimed that they saw a white dove escape from the flames, symbolizing the soul of grandeur ascending to paradise, freed from its earthly torment. Others, more inclined to see evil, said that the smoke momentarily formed the shape of a mocking grin, a final, defiant gesture from the man they had condemned. Step beyond the heavy wooden door of a Parisian brothel, and you entered another world, one that smelled of candle wax, cheap perfume, and spiced wine. The noise of the streets vanished, replaced by laughter, whispers, and the slow strumming of a lute. Inside, sin had etiquette and pleasure had a schedule. It wasn't chaos. It was choreography. Each brothel had its own rhythm. In the front room, guests were greeted by candlelight and wine. The madam, usually seated by the hearth like a queen of shadows, sized up every man who entered. She knew at a glance who would pay well, who would haggle, and who needed a lie whispered in his ear. Behind her, the girls waited, some shy, others bold, each performing a delicate dance between seduction and survival. Rooms upstairs were small but carefully arranged. Silk was rare, but soft linen, flowers, and incense created the illusion of luxury. Mirrors, a true extravagance in the Middle Ages, were sometimes hung near the bed, a novelty meant to dazzle the wealthy and distract from the creaking floorboards. The sound of laughter drifted down the stairs, mingling with the creak of boots and the occasional prayer from a man who couldn't decide whether he was sinning or confessing. Food and drink were part of the performance. Jugs of wine were served to loosen tongues, and platters of roasted meat or honeyed cakes offered the illusion of a feast. Musicians played softly, knowing their melodies helped blur the line between pleasure and penance. For a few hours, the brothel became a kingdom without judgment, a refuge for men escaping the pressures of faith, marriage, or war. But beneath the surface shimmered exhaustion. The women worked long hours, often serving a dozen clients in a night. Disease was an ever-present threat, as were violent patrons. The madam's job wasn't only to count coins. It was to keep the peace, to protect her workers, and to bribe guards when trouble brewed. The average life expectancy, let's just say it was never more than one poorly tended campfire away from flatlining. There were no cozy hotels, no thermoses filled with hot cocoa, and definitely no weather reports to consult. Just a man, his trusty rifle, and that nagging feeling that he'd made a colossal mistake somewhere along the line. When the wind howled through the trees at night, it didn't sound all poetic and romantic. It sounded like the universe itself was doubled over with laughter at your expense. Their relationship with the cold wasn't something you read about in a textbook. It was personal, intimate, and often brutal. You couldn't just fight the cold. You had to learn to bargain with it, to negotiate for your very survival. You'd build a fire using frozen wood, then huddle around it like some shivering philosopher pondering the meaning of life, all while praying that the wind wouldn't decide to switch directions on you. Because if it did, well, congratulations. Your only source of warmth just transformed into a cloud of smoke and a profound sense of disappointment. They ate things that would make a raccoon turn up its nose. Beaver tail, raw bone marrow, meat that was so old it practically qualified as a historical artifact. In their world, gourmet meant anything that didn't make a crunching sound when it wasn't supposed to. But hey, those calories kept you alive, and that was all that mattered in the end. And yet, despite the constant misery, they stayed, because the wilderness offered something that civilization simply couldn't. Silence. The kind of silence that reminded you just how small you were in the grand scheme of things, and how incredibly boneheaded you'd been to come out here in the first place. It was a humbling experience, maybe even a spiritual one for some. Though, let's be honest, mostly it was just really, really cold. Modern folks tend to freak out when the power goes out for a couple of hours. The mountain men, it either went out far too soon, leaving you shivering in the darkness, or it burned far too brightly, setting something on fire, and that something was off in you. You learned to position yourself strategically, so you could wake up just before your boots melted, but not before a thick layer of frost formed on your eyelashes. The night air didn't just whisper. It chewed, it clawed, it burrowed its way into your bones like it was paying rent. You could wrap yourself in every single hide you owned and still feel the cold air breathing through the seams, nipping at your exposed skin. The mountain didn't necessarily want you dead. Not right away. It just wanted to see how close it could push you to the edge, how much you could endure before you finally broke. Sleep came in fragmented snippets, stolen between shivers and curses. You might close your eyes for 20 minutes, wake up with a jolt, feed the dying embers of the fire, curse at the wind, adjust your furs, and then repeat the whole miserable process again and again until morning finally arrived. Dreaming was a risky business, something to be avoided if at all possible. Too much dreaming, and you'd be frozen solid before the sequel could even begin. Sometimes, sheer exhaustion could make you creative, forcing you to find comfort in the most unlikely places. A snowbank became a mattress, a saddle became a pillow, and even a half-dead horse could become a heated waterbed, at least for as long as its residual warmth lasted. The smell wasn't great, admittedly, but you stopped caring about aesthetics somewhere around your third frostbitten toe. In the morning, waking up was never a guarantee, and it was certainly never a pleasant experience. You didn't bother checking the time, because time had largely lost its meaning out there in the wilderness. You checked your pulse. If you could still feel your nose, it was probably going to be a good day. If you couldn't, well, at least you'd have less face to shave. A few just wandered deeper into the mountains and never came back, which, frankly, was the most poetic ending possible. The world moved on. Warmth became easy, comfort became the norm, and survival became something you did by accident. The same mountains that once tested men now hosted vacation lodges. The people sitting by those fireplaces never realized they were staring at the ghost of a harder world. A world that demanded you earn every single degree of heat. The mountain men understood something modern people still haven't figured out. The cold isn't cruel. It's honest. It doesn't pretend to be anything it's not. It doesn't care who you are, what you believe, or how many layers of fancy insulation you can afford. It just asks one question. Can you adapt? They answered that question the only way they knew how, by living long enough to become legends and dying long enough to be forgotten. Their bones became part of the landscape. Their names faded into the names of creeks and valleys, and their legacy burned out like the last ember of a campfire left untended. But the lessons remain, buried under every snowfall, whispered in every gust of wind that rattles a cabin door. The cold still speaks the same language. We've just stopped listening, because somewhere deep in that frozen silence, the mountain men left behind a truth simple enough to survive anything. Warmth is temporary. Cold is forever. And the difference between the two, that fragile flame between life and oblivion, is still the only thing that ever made us human. Step into a medieval kitchen, and the first thing that hits you isn't the food. It's the smoke. It swirls and dances like a living thing, rising up from the massive open hearth that dominates the room. This isn't your neat, modern stovetop with its polite little gas flame. No, this is a fire big enough to roast a whole boar, heat a cauldron the size of a bathtub, and smoke half the family into submission before breakfast. Eating transitioned from a mere act of survival during the harsh winter months to a performance of civilization. Yet, the very spirit of the medieval meal, communal, symbolic, and celebratory, continues to linger in the quieter corners of the modern kitchen. You can still detect faint echoes of that ancient fire. The stew gently simmering on the stove, the bread slowly rising in the oven, the clove you meticulously crush into your apple cider, all whisper stories from the depths of the Middle Ages. Food was an expression of identity then, as it is now, reflecting class, faith, and the boundless reach of human imagination. The medieval kitchen serves as a constant reminder that cuisine is more than mere sustenance. It is a mirror reflecting the culture of its time. In a world governed by faith and fire, cooks did not merely feed bodies. They nourished the very soul of their culture. Their enduring legacy lives on in every meal that seeks to strike a harmonious balance between comfort, flavor, and profound meaning. In the heart of 17th century France, nestled between the gentle curves of the Lyre River and the vast expanse of golden wheat fields, lay the tranquil town of Loudun, a place that, by all accounts, should have been utterly forgettable. Its streets were narrow and cobbled, its churches modest and unassuming, and its people pious in the quiet, unassuming way that characterizes small towns when the world around them feels particularly uncertain. France was under the iron-fisted rule of Cardinal Richelieu, whose policies had significantly tightened the noose on local autonomy. Loudun, once a semi-independent town with a relatively tolerant attitude toward Protestants, was now compelled to bow before the ever-growing power of the Catholic crown. The citizens grumbled in private, offered prayers in public, and eyed one another with a mixture of devout faith and deep-seated suspicion. When it was all over, the ashes were scattered to the winds, and the church triumphantly declared victory, proclaiming that the demons had been expelled, the witch destroyed, and Ludun finally purified from the stain of evil. But the air didn't feel cleansed. It felt hollow and empty, a void left by the destruction of an innocent man. The nuns' fits continued sporadically, even after Grandier's death, their supposed deliverance proving as elusive as the demons that had supposedly possessed them, a constant reminder that something was still amiss in Ludun. Outside of Ludun, whispers of doubt and skepticism began to spread, questioning the fairness of the trial and the validity of the accusations. Some priests quietly questioned the methods used to obtain the so-called confessions, while physicians spoke of hysteria and manipulation, suggesting that the nuns' behavior was rooted in psychological distress rather than demonic possession. Even the king's court, once eager to please Richelieu, grew uneasy about the public spectacle, fearing that it had gone too far and that the execution had created more problems than it had solved. Grandier's execution was intended to silence the scandal and restore order to Ludun. Instead, it immortalized him, transforming him into a symbol of the church's cruelty and the dangers of religious fanaticism. He died proclaiming his innocence, burned at the stake by a church that mistook politics for exorcism and faith for fire. His tragic and a cautionary tale for future generations. And in the flickering light of his pyre, Ludun's demons didn't vanish. They merely changed faces, taking on new forms of oppression and injustice. When the flames finally died down, Ludun expected peace to return, a sense of calm after the storm. Instead, a strange and unsettling silence settled over the town. The kind of eerie quiet that descends after hysteria has run its course and consumed everything in its path, leaving behind a void. Despite the hardship, these places had an odd sort of community. There were birthdays, laughter, even friendships. In a city obsessed with sin, the brothel was paradoxically honest. No pretense, no masks of holiness, just desire, survival, and the quiet understanding that both could exist in the same room. Medieval Paris didn't leave its vices entirely to chance. Even sin required paperwork. Brothels operated under a tangle of city ordinances and ecclesiastical permissions that turned moral contradiction into bureaucracy. The church damned them, the crown licensed them, and the city taxed them, sometimes all in the same week. The regulations were surprisingly detailed. Prostitutes were forbidden to live near churches, to wear certain colors, or to appear in public during religious festivals. Scarlet or striped garments marked them as women of the trade, a badge of shame that also functioned as an advertisement. They couldn't enter markets until late morning, when respectable wives had finished shopping. Even their funerals were controlled. No burial in consecrated ground unless a priest vouched for repentance. And yet, despite this web of restrictions, the city kept meticulous records of their earnings. Tax collectors, conveniently blind to morality, made regular visits to inspect the premises. Brothels paid fees for operation, for security, even for window candles, the little flames that signaled business was open. In return, the women received a measure of protection. Guards patrolled their districts, and violent clients could be punished by law, not because of justice, but because disorder threatened revenue. Still, hypocrisy reigned supreme. During Lent or major feasts, authorities performed moral purges, closing houses of pleasure with theatrical zeal. Yet everyone knew the closures were temporary. The same officials who padlocked doors in March quietly reopened them in April after collecting reinstatement fees. They would have considered that a balmy afternoon. They weren't comfortable, they weren't safe, and they certainly weren't clean. But they were alive, and in their frostbitten, slightly deranged minds, that counted as a win. They weren't necessarily built any different than you or me. They were just built colder. The first thing every mountain man learned, and usually the hard way, was that the cold doesn't hate you. It just doesn't give a damn whether you live or die. You can't intimidate it, you can't bribe it, and you definitely can't reason with it. You can scream at the wind all night long if you want, but trust me, the wind has better things to do with its time. City dwellers these days talk about beating the weather by wearing fancy heated jackets or packing up and moving to Florida. The mountain men knew better than that. You don't beat the weather. You just try to survive its unpredictable mood swings. They learned that lesson early on, usually while standing in snow that was up to their ribs, clutching a piece of flint in one hand and a mountain of regret in the other. Their relationship with the cold was purely transactional. You respected it, and sometimes, just sometimes, it would let you wake up the next morning. You got cocky, and it would immediately remind you who was the real boss of this landscape. The cold wasn't malicious or vindictive. It was simply efficient. It didn't waste any energy punishing you unnecessarily. It just waited patiently for you to screw up. They watched new guys arrive from back east. These fresh-faced dreamers who actually thought that a wool coat was going to be enough to protect them. By nightfall, those dreamers were shivering just like everyone else, contemplating their life choices and their own mortality in equal measure. A seasoned trapper could always spot a newcomer by how loudly they cursed the snow. The old hands didn't even bother. You only curse at things that are actually listening. They didn't sleep because they were tired or because they needed rest. They slept because there was simply nothing else left for them to do. No other way to escape the relentless onslaught of the cold. The night wasn't for dreaming or contemplating the meaning of existence. It was for surviving quietly, one fragile heartbeat at a time, until the sun reluctantly decided to try again. For the mountain men, sleep wasn't a peaceful respite. It was just another maintenance cycle, a necessary evil. Up in the mountains, your tools ultimately decided whether you lived, died, or just wished you had the sweet release of death. There wasn't much room for weak metal or weaker men. Every mountain man carried what amounted to a portable hardware store, a collection of implements designed to prolong their lives, and, perhaps inadvertently, shorten the lives of others. A rifle, a knife, and enough traps to make a modern psychologist deeply concerned about their mental well-being. Their rifles often misfired in the frigid temperatures. Their knives chipped and dulled on frozen bone, and their traps seemed to mangle everything except for the specific animal they were intended to catch. Fixing these broken tools required a genius-level understanding of improvisation and, of course, a robust vocabulary of cursing. You couldn't just run to the store and buy replacements. There were no stores. There were no mail-order catalogs. No friendly blacksmiths waiting patiently in the woods to repair your gear. You just fixed it yourself, using whatever you could find. Animal sinew, strips of bark, or even sheer hope, and then you kept going. A hatchet wasn't just a tool. It was a sacred object, a symbol of resilience. You chopped wood with it, built shelters with it, carved stakes with it, and occasionally used it to express strong opinions on matters of life and death. Flint and steel were revered as sacred artifacts, kept close to the body and guarded like a newborn child. Yet, this smoky chaos was the beating heart of every medieval home. From the peasant's shack to the lord's manor, cooking wasn't just a chore. It was a ritual, a science experiment, and a little bit of witchcraft all rolled into one. The hearth was where survival met superstition. Housewives stirred stew with one hand and crossed themselves with the other, whispering that the pot had to turn clockwise, or the devil would ruin the meal. A good cook was half magician. She had to coax life from ingredients that were often questionable, to say the least. Bread was sometimes patted out with sawdust. Ale was thick enough to stand a spoon in. And meat, when you could get it, had to be smoked or salted to keep the bugs away. There were no forks, just fingers, knives, and the occasional spoon for soups and stews. Sharing a bowl meant sharing germs, and the idea of clean eating meant wiping your hands on whatever piece of bread or apron was closest. And yet, despite all the rough edges, there was artistry here. Spices like cinnamon, pepper, and saffron were rare treasures, hauled over mountains and deserts by traders who risked their necks to bring them. Sprinkling some imported pepper on your stew was like wearing a Rolex to dinner. The hearth also showed you where you stood in society. In grand castles, entire teams of cooks toiled over multiple fires, turning spits by hand, boiling sauces, and baking pies big enough to feed an army. In peasant cottages, the fire was smaller but just as important, the single, flickering flame that kept the family warm and alive through the winter. Every ember counted. In the medieval kitchen, fire wasn't just a tool. It was life itself. It cooked your dinner, lit your nights, and tested how committed your lungs were to survival. Every meal in medieval Europe started with a basic truth. What you ate said everything about who you were. It was an age when faith and fear walked hand in hand, inseparable companions in a world filled with uncertainty. Demons were not merely metaphorical figures of speech. They were believed to lurk behind every illness, every temptation, and every sleepless night. Priests delivered fiery sermons about the eternal torment of hellfire. Women whispered tales of witches lurking in the shadows, and doctors carried more crosses than actual cures. The air in Loudoun was thick with the intoxicating aroma of incense, the ever-present murmur of gossip, and a palpable sense of paranoia, a potent combination of ingredients that made the town a fertile ground for disaster. At the very center of this fragile calm stood the imposing convent of the Ursuline nuns, its walls a physical barrier separating the sacred from the profane. Within those walls resided young women from noble families, sent there to seek holiness, or, perhaps more realistically, to avoid scandal and societal disgrace. Their lives were governed by a rigid and unwavering order. Prayers before the break of dawn, absolute silence after sunset, and strictly no contact with men, with the sole exception of confession to their designated priest. The convent was intended to be a sanctuary, a haven of peace and spiritual reflection. Instead, it would become the stage for one of the most chilling and widely publicized cases of mass hysteria in European history. The people of Loudoun were no strangers to rumors. A missing chicken could easily transform into a full-blown witchcraft tale by nightfall, fueled by the fertile imaginations of the townspeople. The nuns, supposedly liberated from their demonic tormentors, continued to twitch, convulse, and shriek during their prayers, their supposed deliverance proving to be as elusive as the demons that had allegedly possessed them, a constant reminder that something was still deeply wrong in Loudoun. The exorcisms didn't completely stop. They merely lost their initial urgency, becoming a hollow ritual devoid of genuine belief. Without grandeur to blame for their suffering, the chaos felt empty and almost rehearsed, as if the nuns were simply going through the motions, trapped in a cycle of performance. The church had successfully destroyed its scapegoat, but the underlying sickness of blind belief and irrational fear still lingered, poisoning the very soul of the town. Sister Jean de Angies, the prioress who had first accused grandeur and ignited the entire scandal, became something of a celebrity in the aftermath of the execution, her name known throughout France. She traveled across the country, recounting her harrowing ordeal as both a victim of demonic possession and a saintly figure who had been chosen by God to battle the forces of evil, her story captivating audiences wherever she went. Crowds gathered to hear her describe in vivid detail how Satan had possessed her body and how the Virgin Mary had miraculously freed her soul, her words stirring up a mixture of awe and fear in the hearts of her listeners. She even claimed to bear invisible stigmata as proof of her divine suffering, wounds that only she could feel, further solidifying her image as a chosen vessel of God. The church rewarded her piety with public admiration and unwavering support, giving her the very fame and recognition that she seemed to have craved all along, a disturbing blend of religious devotion and personal ambition. The church might have thundered about sin, but the city's coffers depended on its continuation. Punishment, when it came, was selective. A poor prostitute might be flogged or paraded through the streets for public shame, while a wealthy client faced little more than a fine or a discreet confession. If a priest or monk was caught, the church handled it internally, which usually meant exile to another parish and a strongly worded sermon. What emerged from all this was a grim paradox. Prostitution was illegal, immoral, and indispensable. Paris needed its brothels as much as it needed its bakeries. The law might have claimed to govern sin, but in truth it only managed it, ensuring that vice flowed smoothly, quietly, and profitably through the veins of the holy city. To understand the brothels of medieval Paris, one must first understand their geography, a map of sin tucked neatly into the city's anatomy. Pleasure had its own districts, its own economy, and even its own boundaries, approved by those who pretended it didn't exist. Paris wasn't built in innocence. It was built in layers, holy on the surface, carnal underneath. The main artery of this hidden world ran through the left bank, near the university quarter of the Sorbonne. Students, restless and poor, filled the taverns of Rue de la Huchette and Rue Saint-Jacques, where bakeries and wine houses offered more than bread or Bordeaux. Their upper floors were discreetly rented to women of good humor, a euphemism that fooled no one. Their theology students debated morality by day and tested it by night. Closer to the Seine, the district of the site pulsed with another kind of trade. Boatmen, sailors, and merchants found cheap companionship near the bridges. The Pont Neuf and Pont Saint-Michel were unofficial gateways to lust. Candlelit rooms overlooked the water, and the smell of the river mingled with incense and sweat. Frostbite wasn't a question of if. It was always a matter of when. Fingers, ears, noses, they all came with an expiration date. You didn't sit around complaining about it. You just learned to do everything left-handed, or with whatever digits you still had left. They knew that pain was temporary, but stupidity could be fatal. The cold had zero tolerance for poor planning. When your beard froze solid and your coffee turned into slush before you could even get a sip, that was just par for the course. The thermometer hadn't even been invented yet back then, but they already had a much better system for gauging the temperature. If the whiskey froze, it was time to build another fire. And if you froze, well, you probably wouldn't be around to repeat the same mistake. That's what separated them from the rest of us. We think of the cold as an inconvenience, something to complain about. They knew it was a fundamental law of nature, unyielding and unforgiving. They didn't fight it. They adapted. They endured, until even the frost itself couldn't tell whether they were still alive or just another part of the frozen landscape. Because the simple, brutal truth that the mountain men lived by was this: the cold doesn't care. It just waits. Up in the mountains, silence isn't peaceful. It's a warning. The mountain men learned that lesson pretty quickly. You didn't just hear the cold, you read it. The way your breath hung in the air told you how close death was feeling that day. The whole world was one long, unbroken whisper. The rustle of snow, the howl of the wind, and the sound of your stomach regretting whatever it had for breakfast. They called it the white silence. Not because it was pretty or serene, but because it was absolute, all-encompassing. You could scream into it, and your echo would die faster than a campfire in a blizzard. The mountains didn't care about your feelings or your opinions. They demanded obedience. Losing them meant one thing. It was time to find out just how long a human being could survive on raw meat and unadulterated regret. Leather cord, animal sinew, and lengths of frozen rope were what literally tied their lives together, holding their gear together and holding their very existence together. You could always spot a veteran trapper by the way his gear looked, as if it had somehow survived a particularly brutal bar fight. Everything was patched, bent, or slightly on fire. If it worked, even barely, it was deemed good enough. If it broke completely, you just shrugged and called it innovative recycling. But the most important tool they carried wasn't in their hands. It was in their heads. It was their extraordinary tolerance for pain, for hunger, and for the general absurdity of their chosen existence. A mountain man could lose a finger, burn his hand to a crisp, and still finish skinning an elk because stopping to think about it meant acknowledging the pain, and acknowledging the pain would inevitably lead to panic. Modern people tend to panic when their phone battery dies, or when they lose their Wi-Fi signal. A mountain man's idea of a low battery situation was running out of bullets while some large, hungry predator with claws was jogging towards him with a hungry gleam in its eye. He didn't overthink the situation. He didn't complain, or whine, or question his life choices. He just fixed it, or adapted to it, or simply accepted that nature was winning on points once again. Everything they owned was temporary, borrowed from the land, destined to return to the earth sooner or later. Metal rusted, leather rotted, fire eventually faded to ash. But their patience, their ability to endure, that was permanent. Their tools might have broken, but their tolerance never did. And that's the kind of durability that no factory in the world could ever reproduce. The poor man's bowl and the nobleman's platter told two very different stories, both seasoned with class, climate, and just plain luck. For peasants, ingredients came from the earth and not always willingly. Barley, rye, and oats were staples, boiled into a thick stew that could hold a spoon upright. If it wasn't gray, it wasn't done. Vegetables like leeks, onions, and cabbage grew in kitchen gardens, while herbs like parsley, sage, and thyme added a little flavor to what would otherwise be a pretty boring diet. Meat was rare and precious, usually saved for holidays, weddings, or the occasional chicken that had stopped laying eggs. Most peasants knew the taste of salted herring better than they knew the taste of roast beef. For the wealthy, though, the kitchen was a stage for showing off. Noble households demanded a spectacle, and food was the main event. Swans were roasted whole and then dressed up in their own feathers for dramatic effect. Peacocks were stuffed, gilded, and paraded around like edible trophies. The medieval elite loved the idea that a meal could double as a performance, a way to remind everyone at the table that they had a divine right to live large. The difference between the classes was also measured in color and spice. Nobles craved saffron for its golden glow, imported pepper for its kick, and sugar for its decadent sweetness. All of these were brought in at great expense along trade routes from Venice, Cairo, and the East. A pinch of spice could show the world that you were sophisticated. A dish without it might reveal that you were poor. Even the humblest cook knew that taste wasn't just about pleasure. It was about power. But there was a practical side to it, too. Food wasn't just eaten. It was preserved like treasure. Salted, smoked, and pickled foods could be the difference between making it through the winter and starving in it. However, even they were utterly unprepared for the extraordinary events that were about to unfold. The blood-curdling screams emanating from within the convent walls, the reports of nuns writhing on the floor in states of violent contortion, cursing in voices that were undeniably not their own, and the hushed whispers that a local priest had secretly consorted with the devil himself, trading his soul for earthly power. In the 1630s, France was consumed by an obsessive quest for purity. Purity of body, purity of faith, and purity of thought. Anything that threatened this perceived purity was to be ruthlessly purged, exorcised, or even executed without hesitation. Loudun would soon learn firsthand what happens when a community, gripped by fear of sin, begins to hunt for evil where none can be found, turning inward and devouring itself in the process. The demons were indeed coming to Loudun, but they were not the kind that one might find described in Holy Scripture. At the very center of the Loudun affair stood a man who was as brilliant as he was destined for tragedy. Father Urbain Grandier. He was everything that a 17th century priest was emphatically not supposed to be. Handsome, eloquent, arrogant, and undeniably charming. A dangerous combination of traits that made him both admired and deeply resented. His sermons drew massive crowds from miles around, not necessarily because of any particularly profound divine inspiration, but simply because people enjoyed watching him command the pulpit like a seasoned actor on a stage. He spoke with the flamboyant flair of a theatrical performer and the unwavering confidence of a nobleman, and even his most vocal critics were forced to admit, through gritted teeth, that he possessed an undeniable magnetic presence. Grandier's sharp intelligence was matched only by his inherent defiance. Yet, behind her pious facade and carefully constructed image, Jean was haunted by recurring dreams of Grandier, not as the monstrous demon she had once described, but as a wounded and broken man, burning silently in the flames, his eyes filled with an unspoken accusation that pierced through her defenses. She would wake trembling, torn between a sense of triumph and overwhelming guilt, unable to reconcile the image of the evil sorcerer with the memory of the man she had condemned, her conscience a constant torment. Some contemporaries saw through the spectacle, recognizing the underlying manipulation and political maneuvering that had fueled the entire affair. Writers and scholars whispered that Jean's fame was nothing more than a carefully constructed mask for political theater, a tool used by the church and the state to control the narrative and suppress dissent. They saw in her supposed miracles the reflection of an entire nation's madness, a France where repression and religious extremism danced on the same dangerous tightrope, threatening to plunge the country into further chaos. But few dared to voice their concerns aloud, fearing the consequences of challenging the established power structures. In her later years, Jean claimed to have been granted another miracle, a complete healing of her paralysis after making a pilgrimage to the tomb of St. Francis Delaware Sales, a renowned figure of religious devotion. Whether it was a genuine act of divine intervention or simply a case of psychosomatic relief brought on by years of guilt and psychological distress, she interpreted it as a sign that her holiness had been confirmed, further solidifying her place in the annals of religious history. Some of the oldest brothels stood on barges moored to the banks, floating dens of pleasure that drifted just outside the reach of the city's moral patrols. But the most infamous quarter was the Rue de la Tannerie, near the old marketplace of Les Halles. Here, the lines between tavern and brothel blurred completely. Loud laughter, dice games, and drunken songs filled the night. The church called it the Devil's Orchard. The city called it profitable. Each neighborhood had its own clientele. The left bank drew students and clerics. The river, merchants and travelers. Les Halles, laborers and soldiers. It was a social ecosystem of vice, where gold determined discretion. The rich found luxury behind shuttered windows. The poor settled for alleys and back rooms. Ironically, the brothel map often mirrored the sacred one. For every church, there was a tavern. For every monastery, a house of pleasure. The proximity wasn't accidental. Where the church built to control desire, desire built to mock it. And so, beneath the spires of Notre Dame, Paris whispered its truest prayer. Forgive us, for we will sin again. Nowhere was the hypocrisy of medieval Paris more glaring than in the confessional. The church condemned lust with fiery sermons. Yet many of its own clergy were the most devoted customers of the very houses they damned. To the priests of Paris, temptation wasn't just an occupational hazard. It was practically part of the job description. Young clerics studying at the Sorbonne roamed the city at night in their robes, turned inside out, pretending to be scholars while seeking earthly instruction. Confessors who heard the sins of their flock often returned to commit the same ones, sometimes in the same brothel. Chronicles record priests caught in compromising situations, yet punishment was rare. The church, ever protective of its image, preferred to move a sinner to another parish rather than expose him to public scandal. Those who didn't listen, those who thought they knew better, became cautionary tales whispered around the fire. Every mountain man knew how to interpret the language of the snow as if it were sacred scripture. If it squeaked underfoot, the cold was serious, and you needed to watch your step. If it crunched, it was survivable, at least for now. If it didn't make a sound at all, congratulations. You were in real trouble. They could smell a storm coming from miles away, taste the ice in the air, and feel the pressure dropping in their very bones. Modern folks pull out their weather apps. The mountain men were the weather app. They knew instinctively how to walk through deep snow without sinking, how to build a fire that wouldn't smother itself, and how to find shelter by reading the shadows cast by the mountains. You didn't just wonder or speculate. You observed, you listened, you learned. A subtle shift in the wind meant that a storm was brewing, and it had your name on it. A sudden silence in the woods meant that something nearby was considering you for dinner. Even the animals served as living meteorologists. When the crows flew low to the ground, snow was on its way. When the wolves went silent, it was already here. You learned to listen to everything, to decipher the whispers of the wilderness. The creaking of the trees, the calls of the birds, even the sound of your own shivering heartbeat. Modern civilization calls it intuition. The mountain men called it paying attention. They didn't survive because they were tougher or braver than anyone else. They survived because they noticed the subtle clues that the wilderness provided. The wilderness was generous to those who respected it, and utterly brutal to everyone else. You can't learn that kind of awareness from a podcast or a book. You learn it by spending 3 nights lost in a snowstorm, gnawing on frozen jerky, and realizing that nature doesn't do refunds. The mountain men didn't conquer the white silence. Out in the mountains, the body was the only teacher that truly mattered, and it didn't believe in giving gentle lessons. You didn't train for the cold. You just suffered through it day after day, week after week, until your blood somehow learned the syllabus, until your very cells adapted to the harsh environment. Every day was a brutal biology experiment, conducted by someone who dropped out of school at a very young age. At first, newcomers fought the cold, resisting it with every fiber of their being. They stomped their feet, cursed at the wind, bundled themselves in layers of clothing, and complained incessantly, as if the weather might eventually apologize for inconveniencing them. But the mountain men knew better. The body always adapts much faster than the brain. The mind might scream, "This is insane. We need to get out of here." while the flesh quietly mutates into something that can comfortably sleep on a bed of ice and call it refreshing. After a few winters in the mountains, your skin grew tougher than the thickest leather you wore. Your nerves dulled, and pain became just another form of background noise. You stopped checking to see if you were bleeding, because the answer was almost always yes. Fingers became tools, appendages adapted for gripping, skinning, and surviving. Feet transformed into hooves, calloused and unfeeling, perfectly suited for traversing the frozen landscape. You weren't really a man anymore, not in the traditional sense. You were more like a semi-domesticated mammal with a drinking problem, an animal that had somehow learned to tolerate the cold. They didn't talk about mental resilience or emotional fortitude, because that required acknowledging feelings, and most of those had frozen off long ago. You just kept moving forward, putting one foot in front of the other, regardless of how much it hurt. Your body learned efficiency through constant punishment. Honey, the medieval sweetener of choice, was also used as medicine and a preservative, proving that nature's pantry could heal as well as feed. In the medieval kitchen, ingredients weren't just tools for staying alive. They were social currency, symbols of faith, and signs of fortune. An entire way of life boiled down into whatever you could fit in your pot. If the medieval kitchen had a secret weapon, it was spice. Not the kind you sprinkle on your French fries, but treasures that were worth their weight in gold. Cinnamon from Ceylon, black pepper from India, and cloves so rare that owning a small pouch could make you the envy of the royal court. These weren't just seasonings. They were symbols of power, wealth, and sophistication. They were hauled across continents by traders who risked pirates, plagues, and deserts just to bring us some flavor. To modern palates, medieval food might seem strangely sweet. That's because sugar was also considered a spice, a dazzling white luxury from the East. Nobles didn't just sweeten desserts. They added sugar to meats, fish, and sauces. A roast might be glazed with honey and dusted with cinnamon, while wine could be boiled with cloves and served steaming to guests as a sign of wealth. The result was a flavor profile that blurred the lines between savory and sweet. Think turkey leg meets gingerbread. Behind the glamour, though, spices had a more practical purpose. They were the great disguisers. In a time before refrigeration, meat often arrived with a mind of its own, and not a pleasant one. Spices could mask the taste of decay, turning questionable cuts into aromatic delicacies. The medieval cook knew this trick well, though they'd never admit it at a feast. But spices did more than just hide flaws. They also reflected the superstitions of the time. Medieval doctors believed food affected the body's four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Pepper was hot and dry, perfect for balancing cold illnesses. He openly mocked the church hierarchy, challenged the authority of the town officials, and steadfastly refused to bow before Cardinal Richelieu's increasingly restrictive policies. Loudun was one of the few remaining towns with deep-seated Protestant roots, and Grandier openly defended its right to maintain its independence, a decision that quickly branded him as a political nuisance in the eyes of the ruling powers. However, it was not his political views that would ultimately lead to his downfall. It was his undeniable charm and the effect it had on the women of Loudun. Whispers followed him like the lingering scent of incense smoke. Women, both noble and common, sought him out for confession, and many of them lingered longer than strictly necessary, drawn in by his captivating presence. He was rumored to have fathered illegitimate children, seduced countless widows, and used his pastoral visits for purposes that required no scripture whatsoever. His enemies, and he had amassed quite a few over the years, waited patiently, like vultures circling a dying animal, for the perfect scandal to emerge and finally destroy him. That scandal arrived in the form of the Ursuline nuns. Their new convent required a spiritual advisor, and Grandier, as the most prominent and respected priest in Loudun, was the obvious choice for the position. However, when he declined the appointment, citing prior commitments and other duties, he inadvertently sealed his own tragic fate. His rejection deeply wounded the pride of the convent's prioress, a woman named Sister Jean de Angers, whose vivid imagination was as fervent as her unwavering faith. Soon after his refusal, Sister Jean began to claim that Grandier haunted her dreams. She recounted vivid visions of him appearing in her cell late at night, whispering temptations and offering caresses, his form shifting between angelic and demonic, a confusing mix of holiness and corruption. Sister Jean de Ange's died peacefully, cloaked in a reputation of unwavering piety and surrounded by an aura of near sainthood, yet forever haunted by the ghosts of her past, one of them forever whispering her name in the swirling smoke and crackling fire of a long-ago execution. The cult of personality that she had inspired outlived her, a lasting monument to the dangers of mass hysteria and the ease with which blind faith can be sanctified as truth, a cautionary tale for future generations. Centuries later, the story of the possessed nuns of Loudun continues to haunt the European imagination, a chilling reminder of the dark side of human nature and the destructive power of unchecked religious zeal. The events that unfolded in that small French town in the 1630s were not simply an isolated outbreak of hysteria. They were a reflection of a broader societal crisis, a mirror held up to an age when religion and politics were inextricably intertwined, when women's bodies became battlegrounds for competing ideologies, and when the line between the sacred and the obscene blurred beyond recognition, leaving people vulnerable to manipulation and exploitation. Historians have long debated the true nature of what occurred in Loudun, offering various interpretations of the events. Some argue that the possessions were the result of a collective psychological crisis, a product of widespread repression, social isolation, and the suggestive power of authority, with the nuns acting as vessels for the anxieties and fears of the community. Others insist that it was a carefully orchestrated piece of political theater, engineered by Richelieu's agents to eliminate a defiant priest and consolidate the power of the crown, sacrificing an innocent man for the sake of political expediency. Some clergy rationalized their behavior with absurd theology. They argued that by experiencing temptation firsthand, they could better understand and absolve it in others. Others called it a mercy. Better they sin with a fallen woman than defile a virgin. The logic was appalling but effective. The pulpit stayed occupied, the brothels stayed open, and the tithe stayed steady. Certain brothels even specialized in clerical clientele. Located near churches and monasteries, they offered discretion, fine wine, and women skilled in flattery rather than romance. The madams knew to keep names off the books and mouths shut. A single indiscretion could ruin a priest's career or, worse, reveal the church's comfortable complicity. The line between confession and seduction blurred. Some women described priests asking them to reenact temptations of the flesh so they could resist them, a rehearsal of virtue that ended predictably in sin. Others were asked to repent alongside their customers in whispered parody of absolution. The sacred and profane shared the same bed. Yet the church's hypocrisy served a purpose. By quietly managing vice, it controlled it. Better to own the brothels in spirit than let the devil profit unchecked. And so the holy city of Paris lived a double life. Prayers at dawn, indulgence at dusk. The priests preached purity, but the streets told a different sermon, one written not in scripture, but in sighs behind shuttered windows. By the late 15th century, the secret brothels of Paris had begun to lose their protection. The Black Death, the 100 Years' War, and waves of religious reform changed how the city viewed sin. Where once lust had been tolerated as a necessary evil, it now became a symbol of divine punishment. Plague was blamed on moral decay, and women of the trade were branded not just as sinners, but as walking contagions, the physical embodiment of the city's corruption. As fear spread, reformers demanded purification. They just learned to speak its language. Slowly, quietly, and always with a layer of frost clinging to their beards. For a mountain man, heat wasn't a luxury or a comfort. It was a form of currency as precious as gold. Every spark, every ember, every flickering flame was like a paycheck from the universe. A cosmic pat on the back saying, "Congratulations, pal. You get to live for another hour." Modern people treat warmth like it's a basic human right. Mountain men treated it like a freaking miracle. Their version of turning up the heat involved flint, frozen fingers, and the growing suspicion that God was up there somewhere, laughing his divine but off at their struggles. Making a fire in the middle of a blizzard wasn't just a skill. It was an argument with nature itself. And nature, let's face it, always had the better lawyers. They carried their tinder like it was literal treasure. Scraps of dry bark, clumps of dry moss, and bits of cloth that hadn't yet frozen solid. They knew exactly how long a single log would burn, how quickly the snow could drown a flame, and approximately how many curses it took before smoke finally turned into fire. On average, about 7. When you finally saw that tiny flicker of orange light cutting through the darkness, it felt like a genuinely holy experience. But fire wasn't just about warmth. It was about companionship, too. A campfire was the only voice that would answer back, crackling, hissing, and throwing light into a world that seemed determined to wipe you off the map. Sitting near the fire, wrapped in animal hides, you didn't spend your time thinking about philosophy or composing poetry. You thought about how long the fire would last and whether your boots were going to catch fire before your toes froze off. The fire taught you efficiency. You learned to cook everything directly on the coals. Meat, snow, for melting, of course, and even your own optimism. It learned how to breathe slowly and deliberately, so your lungs wouldn't feel like they were being stabbed with icicles. It learned how to walk without wasting a single ounce of energy. It learned how to sleep without actually relaxing, how to enter a state of suspended animation that allowed you to conserve your precious resources. Chronic cold exposure changed everything, fundamentally altering your metabolism, your sanity, and even your very definition of the word, fine. A veteran trapper could sit motionless in the snow for hours on end, watching a trapline with the unwavering patience of a statue made of frost and regret. He didn't fidget, he didn't blink, and he didn't complain. He'd simply reached a state of enlightenment through prolonged exposure to hypothermia. The cold had carved them, shaped them, and transformed them into something almost unrecognizable, something both stronger and more broken than they had ever been before. The weak either became strong, or they simply ceased to exist, disappearing into the frozen landscape without a trace. Strength wasn't just a personality trait. It was a consequence of survival, a byproduct of enduring the unendurable. They didn't consciously decide to be tough. They just never got around to dying, and that made all the difference. Modern people like to call that grit or resilience. Mountain men just called it Tuesday. Their bodies learned, long before their minds ever caught up, how to live with constant pain, how to endure mind-numbing boredom, and how to keep going even when comfort was just a distant rumor. And by the time their minds finally understood what was happening, by the time they finally grasped the full extent of their suffering, the lesson was already complete. The body had passed the test, and the mind was just there to grade it, albeit a little late. Pain, for the mountain men, wasn't a symptom or a warning sign. It was just another part of the daily forecast, like frost or bad news. Cinnamon warmed the heart, while saffron supposedly lifted the soul. So when your lord sprinkled nutmeg on his pudding, he wasn't just showing off. He was warding off melancholy. The spice trade transformed the medieval world. Venice got rich as the middleman between East and West. Kings taxed pepper like gold, and cooks, once just humble servants, became minor celebrities in noble courts for mastering the mysterious flavors of faraway lands. In the medieval kitchen, spice wasn't just a garnish. It was global power ground into powder. Every grain of pepper told a story of conquest, commerce, and culinary ambition. It proves that even in a world without forks, people still craved sophistication. Cooking in the Middle Ages was equal parts craftsmanship, improvisation, and well-managed chaos. Forget the recipe book. Medieval cooks didn't measure in teaspoons or grams. They measured in instinct. A good handful, a little while, or until it smells right. And since every fire burned differently and every pot had its own quirks, two cooks could make the same dish and end up with wildly different results. One delicious, one potentially fatal. The kitchen of a noble household was like a living machine, powered by people. There were spit boys, often young and unlucky, whose only job was to sit by the fire for hours, turning meat until it roasted evenly. There were scullions who scrubbed cauldrons black with soot, kneaders who wrestled bread dough like they were prize fighters, and master cooks who directed it all like generals before a battle. Orders flew, pans clanged, dogs loitered for scraps, and the smell of roasting meat mixed with smoke and sweat. But despite all the chaos, there was some actual science happening, or at least what they thought was science. Cooks were guided by the theory of the humors. Balance your ingredients, or you risk unbalancing the body. Her confessions spread through the convent like wildfire. Within a matter of weeks, other nuns began to experience similar visions, describing Grandier's ghostly visits, demons crawling through their rooms, and sin brazenly disguised as sanctity. A priest had been transformed into a phantom. A convent had become a stage for the unfolding drama, and Ludun, already teetering on the brink of chaos, was about to explode in a frenzy of hysteria. It began quietly enough. A few sleepless nights, hushed murmurs of prayers, and nervous laughter echoing behind the convent walls. But soon, something shifted, a subtle but significant change that signaled the beginning of the end. One by one, the Ursuline nuns began to convulse, shriek, and collapse in the chapel. They spoke in strange, guttural voices, cursed fluently in Latin, a language they had never been taught, and claimed that invisible hands were touching them in the darkness. Some of them rolled on the floor in fits of violent agony, while others screamed Grandier's name as though he were both their tormentor and their savior, a figure of both intense fear and twisted desire. Sister Jean de Angies was the loudest and most theatrical of them all. Her confessions became elaborate performances, deeply emotional and strangely captivating. She described in vivid detail how Grandier's spectral figure entered her cell at night, his face radiant, his words blasphemous. She swore that he had led an entire army of demons into the convent with the express purpose of seducing and corrupting them. She named the spirits with grotesque and chilling names: Leviathan, Behemoth, Astaroth, and claimed that they were locked in a fierce battle for her very soul. At first, the local clergy dismissed these bizarre occurrences as a combination of hysteria and an outbreak of some unknown illness. However, the unusual behavior spread far too quickly and dramatically to be easily dismissed. And then there are those who believe that the nuns were victims of something deeper, a complex interplay of genuine religious belief and a fundamental human need to find meaning and purpose in the face of chaos. Their minds susceptible to suggestion and their emotions easily manipulated. Whatever the underlying cause, the story of Ludun remains a stark reminder of how easily fear can be weaponized and how quickly a society, once it has sanctified that fear, can become unstoppable in its pursuit of perceived evil, sacrificing innocent lives in the name of religious or political purity. Father Urbain Grandier's name has endured through the centuries, remembered as both a villain and a martyr, a figure whose story has been reinterpreted and reimagined in countless ways. Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire later cited his trial as a prime example of the Church's cruelty, corruption, and inherent superstition, using his tragic fate to critique the abuses of religious power. In the 20th century, his story was reborn through various artistic mediums, inspiring plays, operas, and films that explored the psychological and political dimensions of the Ludun affair, ensuring that his memory would live on. From Aldous Huxley's novel The Devils of Ludun to Ken Russell's infamous 1971 film adaptation, the story of Grandier and the possessed nuns has continued to captivate audiences, prompting them to question the nature of faith, power, and the darkness that resides within the human heart. Devils, with each retelling of their story, shed another layer of myth, revealing the same unsettling truth. Reason crumbles easily when draped in the robes of holiness. Sister Jean de Angies, in the meantime, stands as a symbol of contradiction, part saint, part manipulator, and part victim of her own making. Her diary remains, filled with ecstatic visions and agonizing remorse. Brothels were raided, madams imprisoned, and women publicly flogged through the streets. King Charles VIII ordered several red light districts closed, declaring that the city must no longer serve both God and the devil. Of course, sin doesn't vanish when outlawed. It merely changes its address. The wealthy found ways to continue discreetly in private homes or behind tavern doors. For the poor, the trade grew harsher, moving from regulated houses to the filth of alleys and riverbanks. The church, which had once profited from the business, turned on it with sudden ferocity. Sermons thundered about fallen daughters of Eve and the harlotry that defiled Christendom. Yet even as officials closed brothels, confessionals stayed full. The moral cleansing of Paris was less about holiness than optics, a performance of virtue in a city built on contradiction. Some women vanished into convents, their sins exchanged for prayers. Others died nameless, their stories erased by the same institutions that once taxed them. The madams who survived often reinvented themselves as innkeepers or herbalists, their knowledge of men's desires replaced by knowledge of their ailments. And yet, the memory of those brothels never truly disappeared. Beneath the cobblestones of modern Paris lie the remains of cellars where laughter once echoed and candles once flickered in defiance of shame. The church pretended to forget them, but the city did not. Their legacy lingered in its slang, its literature, and its endless fascination with the boundary between sin and survival. The secret brothels of medieval Paris were never just places of pleasure. They were reflections of a society at war with itself. A city that built cathedrals to save souls also built rooms to tempt them. And in that contradiction, Paris found its truest identity: sacred, sinful, and eternally enchanting. You stopped wasting time making coffee because it would freeze solid halfway through the pour. Instead, you just ate it like a popsicle and called it frontier style. They knew that warmth was temporary, fragile, and always earned twice. Once with sweat and once with smoke. If you got careless for even a moment, the wind would snatch it away. If you slept too close to the flames, the sparks would come for you. Fire demanded respect, just like the cold. When the night stretched out too long and the temperature plummeted past the point of rational thought, the mountain men didn't sit around begging for warmth. They built it themselves from scratch. They didn't expect comfort. They created survival. And that's what ultimately separated them from the rest of us. We live surrounded by heat, and we still complain about being cold. They lived inside the very heart of winter itself, and they considered it just another Tuesday evening. To survive in the mountains, you didn't necessarily need bravery or exceptional physical strength. You needed insulation, both physical and mental. Mountain men figured out early on that the best way to stay alive was to dress like a small, furry bear and think like someone who'd already accepted their own funeral. They wore layers upon layers, not for the sake of fashion, but for the sake of negotiation. First came the shirt, usually made of wool, and often soaked in regret. Then a vest, a thick coat, and an outer layer of fur that was so dense it could have legally voted as another person. By the end of winter, most of them looked like pieces of furniture that had somehow learned to walk. Washing those layers was completely unheard of. Soap froze, water froze, even the very concept of cleanliness seemed to freeze solid in that environment. The resulting smell was its own self-contained ecosystem, a potent combination of sweat, smoke, animal grease, and a long string of bad decisions. You didn't bother asking if it would hurt. You just asked what kind of hurt you were going to get today. Everything in the wilderness had teeth, claws, or sharp edges, including your own worn-out boots. The relentless cold cracked your skin and left it raw and bleeding. The wind flayed your face, leaving it permanently wind-burned, and every muscle in your body protested with every step you took, as if it was actively trying to form its own labor union. But pain wasn't something you could avoid. It was just background noise, like the howling wind, the oppressive loneliness, or the sound of wolves arguing over your discarded trash. Cuts got infected, fingers blackened and withered, joints swelled to twice their normal size. You fixed it the old-fashioned way, with a generous swig of whiskey and a healthy dose of denial. If it didn't kill you outright, it was probably fine. And if it did kill you, well, at least you wouldn't have to wake up early anymore. There were no doctors, no bandages, and absolutely no sympathy to be found in the mountains. You cauterized your own wounds with a hot iron, spat on your burns, and kept moving forward, because the snow didn't care that you were having a rough day. Aching bones were badges of honor, visible proof of your endurance. Frostbite was practically a handshake, a sign of mutual respect. You'd proudly show off your blackened, shriveled toes like trophies, tangible evidence that you'd survived another grueling lesson from nature's unforgiving curriculum. The only thing softer than your weathered body was your mind, and the cold took care of that, too, stripping away the unnecessary fluff and leaving only the raw, essential core. Pain simplified life, brutally and efficiently. It erased luxury, distraction, and introspection, focusing your attention solely on the immediate task at hand: survival. When everything hurts, you stop worrying about philosophy, politics, or the latest gossip from back east. If a dish was too cold, like fish or lettuce, it needed some heat, maybe a dash of ginger or a splash of wine. Food wasn't just about taste. It was about keeping your health and your soul in harmony. Still, mistakes happened. Too much salt could ruin a feast. A smoky fire could turn a whole boar black. Undercooked poultry might send an entire noble family running for the outhouse. There were no thermometers, no timers, no second chances. A good cook's reputation was everything, and one bad dish could mean a demotion or, worse, a beating from an impatient lord. Yet, when it worked, medieval cooking could be magnificent. Pies stuffed with quail and almonds, sauces thickened with bread and wine, pastries filled with figs and honey, all made from scratch by firelight. It was dirty, exhausting, and often dangerous, but it was also deeply creative. In the medieval kitchen, chaos was just another ingredient, and mastery meant taming it just long enough to serve something fit for both body and spirit. To really understand medieval cooking, you have to see the difference between the feast and the famine. On one hand, there were the endless banquets of kings and lords, tables weighed down with roasted boar, almond tarts, and goblets of spiced wine. On the other, there were the lean years when peasants scraped by on watery stew and stale bread, praying that next year's harvest wouldn't fail them. Feasts weren't just about eating. They were public displays. Every course announced rank and wealth. Nobles didn't just dine. They flaunted their power through sheer abundance. A roasted peacock wasn't served because it tasted good. It didn't. It was served because it looked spectacular, with its feathers reattached and gilded like a trophy in edible form. And while the guests applauded the spectacle, the servants probably ate leftovers behind the kitchen doors, if they were lucky. At the high tables, there was etiquette, of course, though still no forks. Within days, nearly every nun in the convent was seemingly possessed. They clawed at the altar, levitated during their fits, and shouted obscenities that would make even seasoned sailors blush with embarrassment. Witnesses swore that they had seen impossible things. Nuns floating several inches above the ground, holy water boiling in its font, and crucifixes trembling violently on the walls. The convent quickly became a public spectacle, drawing crowds of onlookers eager to witness the unfolding drama. Word of the possessed Ursulines spread far beyond the borders of Loudun, attracting priests, doctors, and the merely curious from all corners of France. Exorcists arrived by the dozen, armed with relics, holy water, and an unwavering determination to battle Satan himself. The nuns' blood-curdling screams became the town's new and unsettling soundtrack, a constant reminder of the dark forces at play. However, for all the talk of devils and demons, the unfolding drama had a distinctly human undercurrent, a sense that something else was at play beneath the surface. Many observers noted that the possessions grew noticeably more theatrical whenever an audience was present. The women seemed acutely aware of who was watching: priests, nobles, or soldiers, and their fits grew wilder and more exaggerated, their voices louder and more piercing. Some fainted dramatically, while others claimed to see Grandier's face lurking in the shadows, a constant reminder of their tormentor. The church, sensing both potential danger and a unique opportunity, began to investigate the situation in earnest. If the devil had indeed chosen Loudun as his playground, then France needed a resounding victory and a readily available scapegoat to appease the masses. And who better to play the role of the villain than the defiant, unrepentant priest who was already rumored to have seduced half the town? The stage was set, the players were in place, and the exorcisms were about to begin. Some view her as the first documented case of psychosomatic possession, while others see her as a tragic woman trapped by the expectations of a faith that demanded either purity or perdition, with no middle ground. Today, the ruins of Loudun still whisper their story. Tourists visit the spot where Grandier was burned, now marked by a simple plaque. The convent is long gone, but the echo of its screams lingers in every account. The Loudun case reminds us that hysteria doesn't require demons, only fear, power, and a willing audience. and perhaps the most terrifying lesson of all. That belief, once inflamed, can burn brighter and crueler than any fire ever lit in that doomed French square. In medieval Paris, sin and salvation dwelled side by side, separated only by the width of a street. The same city that erected towering cathedrals also constructed an underground network of desire, hidden behind the aroma of fresh bread and cheap wine. By day, monks strolled the cobbled lanes, chanting psalms. By night, the same stones echoed with laughter, whispers, and the rustle of cloaks slipping into forbidden doorways. Paris was Europe's beating heart, crowded, chaotic, and intoxicating. Merchants hawked prices in the market, students from the Sorbonne debated theology, and beggars waited by the bridges for coins or confessions. Yet, behind this noisy facade of respectability, another economy thrived, one that traded not in gold or grain, but in pleasure. Tucked away between bakeries, taverns, and wine cellars were the maisons closes, discreet brothels known only to those who could afford sin and silence. They weren't marked by any signboard or lantern. A flicker of candlelight in an upstairs window, a curtain drawn twice, or a loaf of bread left intentionally uncut could serve as the signal. For those in the know, Paris was a map of temptation drawn in invisible ink. The church thundered from the pulpit that lust was a mortal sin. You could track a mountain man from miles away, simply by following the aroma. Wolves certainly could. Usually, they opted to go in the opposite direction. Their coats were heavy, their hats were ridiculous, and their boots were perpetually damp. Every single garment told a story, and that story was usually about failure. That patch on the shoulder? That was from a close encounter with a campfire that went rogue. Those seams near the knees? Evidence of a particularly nasty fall that ended with a whole lot of creative cursing. A mountain man's wardrobe wasn't about style. It was about surviving another conversation with the weather, another day of wrestling with the elements. But those layers weren't just made of fabric and fur. They were also a kind of armor, a defense against the madness that could creep in when you were isolated and alone. When you're weeks deep into solitude, and your only conversation partner is your own echo, a little bit of weight on your shoulders serves as a constant reminder that you still exist. The fur, the smell, the constant physical discomfort. It kept you tethered to the real world, no matter how miserable that world might be. Modern folks like to talk about winter fashion, about the latest trends and styles. Mountain men talked about not dying. They didn't wear designer jackets. They wore whatever hadn't been eaten by moths, wolves, or their own horses yet. The fancier trappers might have sported fringed coats and moccasins, but underneath all the aesthetics, they were all just cold and smelly philosophers, mumbling about firewood and fate. By the time spring finally rolled around and the snow began to melt, they'd peel those layers off like strips of tree bark, revealing the pale, malnourished human being inside. Blinking, dazed, and wondering why in the world he'd ever traded a warm bed for this insane life. And yet, as soon as the next winter came knocking, they did it all over again. They didn't complain because nobody was going to listen anyway. And even if someone did happen to listen, what was there to say? Yeah, it's cold. Yeah, it hurts. Yeah, I'm probably gonna die out here. So what? It's freezing. Of course, that was the whole idea. Pain was the signal that you were still kicking. Numbness? That meant you were losing ground. These days, people call a little discomfort burnout. A mountain man's burnout involved actual flames. We whine about back pain from our desk chairs. They slept on solid ice and called it a chiropractic adjustment. Their lives were a never-ending wrestling match between agony and just not caring anymore. Too cold to feel anything, too stubborn to give up. Pain wasn't a punishment. It was a reminder. You were still here, still breathing, still being a nuisance to the wilderness by refusing to just lie down and die. In a world that never apologized, the mountain men learned the oldest truth there is. Pain isn't the enemy. It's the only honest thing the cold will ever give you. Solitude was the mountain man's constant companion. Loud, moody, and always hanging around when you wanted it to leave. For months on end, the only heartbeat you'd hear was your own. And even that sounded worn out way out there. Conversation was optional. mostly because there wasn't anyone left to talk to who hadn't already frozen solid. Your best buddies were your horse, your dog, and your rifle, and not always in that order. The horse carried your gear and silently judged your life choices. The dog shared your fire and, if you were feeling generous, your dinner. The rifle kept both of you from becoming dinner for something else. It was a healthy, codependent triangle of survival and a little bit of crazy. Men would go whole seasons without seeing another human being, talking to themselves until their own voices started sounding like strangers. You learned to argue with your echo and lose every time. Loneliness wasn't romantic. Nobles used knives and trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread that served as edible plates. The wealthy dined well, right next to the dish, while servants or lower-ranking guests sat further down the hall, often eating the same food but colder and in smaller portions. The line between nobility and servitude was measured by how close you were to the salt cellar, literally. Sitting above the salt meant you mattered. Below it, you were just decorative. For the peasants, dining was less a ceremony and more about survival. Meals were communal, often eaten from a shared pot in the center of the table. The portions were simple but filling. Barley stew with bits of turnip or leeks, maybe a scrap of bacon if they were lucky. Yet, even among the poor, the act of eating together was sacred. Food connected the family, the village, the seasons. Superstition surrounded every meal. Breaking bread the wrong way could bring bad luck. Wasting salt was a sin. Eating without saying grace was practically inviting misfortune or indigestion. The medieval kitchen, whether feeding kings or shepherds, was never just about food. It was about ritual, reputation, and resilience. A performance where every dish told a story of faith, fear, and survival. If medieval cooking had a soul, it lived in its sauces. These weren't just condiments. They were culinary spells, each designed to transform the ordinary into something extraordinary. A roast goose without sauce was a missed opportunity. A fish without it was an act of neglect. Medieval cooks treated sauce-making as an art form, a way to balance the four humors, disguise tough meat, and show off their sophistication. One of the most beloved sauces was galantine, a thick, spice sauce made from breadcrumbs, broth, and vinegar, often colored with blood or saffron. For richer tables, almond milk became a base. Crushed almonds mixed with water created a creamy liquid used in everything from stews to desserts. By 1633, Loudun had transformed into a macabre circus of sanctity and spectacle, a bizarre fusion of religious fervor and theatrical performance. The convent's once quiet halls now echoed with the incessant sounds of shrieks, chants, and the metallic clatter of chains. Exorcisms were no longer private rituals. They had become public theater, drawing massive crowds of spectators. Throngs of people gathered outside the convent gates to hear the nuns' agonizing screams, and the priests conducted their rites with all the dramatic flair of a stage production, carefully playing to their captivated audience. Every violent convulsion, every blasphemous utterance, and every desperate cry for deliverance drew gasps and applause from the onlookers, who were swept up in the unfolding drama. At the very center of the storm was Sister Jean de Anges, whose fits grew more extravagant and elaborate with each passing day. She twisted her body into seemingly impossible shapes, spat out holy water with astonishing force, and claimed to see demons flying above the altar, their grotesque faces leering down at her. During one particularly dramatic exorcism, she reportedly floated several inches off the ground, her eyes rolled back in her head and her mouth frothing uncontrollably, undeniable proof, according to the clergy, that Satan himself had taken up residence in Loudun. Jean, however, seemed strangely energized by the constant attention. She began to speak in grand proclamations, declaring herself both the bride of Christ and the victim of Grandier's dark sorcery, a complex and contradictory figure. Exorcists came and went, each one eager to make a name for himself by vanquishing the forces of evil. Father Lactance and Father Tranquil led the elaborate rituals with theatrical flair, shouting commands at invisible spirits and interrogating the nuns as though they were conducting a courtroom drama, seeking to uncover the truth behind the possessions. Who sent you? Yet Parisian priests walked past these brothels every day. They denounced vice in sermons, then quietly blessed the men who profited from it. The truth was, the city's moral order depended on its hidden sins. Brothels were the pressure valves of a society obsessed with purity, places where men could indulge what the church forbade and then return to confession, cleansed and ready to sin again. To a foreign visitor, Paris might have seemed holy, a city crowned by Notre Dame and governed by devotion. But those who lived there knew better. Behind every convent was a tavern. Behind every chapel, a bed for rent. Knights, merchants, and clerks of the church all walked the same narrow alleys after dusk, their armor or robes exchanged for anonymity. The brothels of medieval Paris weren't just dens of desire. They were mirrors. In their candlelight flickered the hypocrisy of an age that worshipped chastity but thrived on temptation. Sin wasn't the city's secret. It was its second heartbeat. The women who lived and worked in the brothels of medieval Paris were ghosts in daylight and queens at night. Society called them sinners, but in the dim glow of tallow candles, they ruled small kingdoms of their own making. Most hadn't chosen this life. It had chosen them. Poverty, war, and hunger drove countless women to the city, and Paris, for all its grandeur, offered few options. A woman without a husband, family, or trade was invisible, unless she sold what men most desired and most despised. Some came from the countryside, fleeing famine or the shame of bearing a child out of wedlock. Others were widows or wives abandoned by soldiers who never returned. For many, the brothel was less a moral fall than an act of survival. There, at least, they had food, warmth, and a roof, privileges not guaranteed to the respectable poor freezing outside. Inside the maison close, life had its own rules, because survival, as they knew it, wasn't just a necessity. It was an addiction. When it came to food, mountain men didn't eat for pleasure or enjoyment. They ate for pure thermodynamics. Calories weren't about nutrition. They were simply firewood for the body, fuel to keep the engine running. If it burned, it worked. If it didn't, you died a slightly more poetic death, but you died nonetheless. Dinner was whatever didn't kill you first. They boiled, roasted, or occasionally just gnawed raw on whatever moved slower than they did. Beaver tail was considered a delicacy, a rare treat to be savored. Elk tongue was a genuine luxury. The rest of the animal was just fuel with fur attached, something to keep you going. If it had fat on it, it was worth its weight in gold. If it didn't, well, it was a harsh but valuable lesson. The menu changed depending on just how desperate you were at any given moment. During good weeks, you might get a hearty rabbit stew, simmered with whatever edible plants you could scrounge up. During bad weeks, you might end up eating the same rabbit twice. Jerky was the staple food, the main course, the dessert, and the primary source of moral support all rolled into one convenient package. It was tough enough to break your teeth, which was just fine, since their dental care strategy revolved around the principle of don't die of infection. They hunted in near total silence, not necessarily out of some profound respect for nature, but simply because chewing too loudly could scare away your next meal. A missed shot wasn't just a failure. It was a week of gnawing hunger wrapped in a blanket of regret. They learned to use every single part of an animal, wasting nothing. Bones were for making broth, hides were for building shelters, sinew was for sewing clothes and mending equipment, and the smell was for keeping unwanted visitors and nosy neighbors away. Salt was so valuable that it was literally worth its weight in gold. It was just another kind of hunger gnawing at you. You started giving names to things, your traps, your boots, the campfire, because eventually something had to answer back. Some men couldn't handle it. The silence was too vast, too never-ending. They'd start hearing voices on the wind or swear they saw shadows moving just outside the firelight. Maybe they did. Or maybe that's just what happens when your social circle consists of wolves and ghosts. Animals were the closest thing to companionship. A horse's breath on a cold night was the only sign of life some nights. Dogs were worth their weight in gold. Hunters, guards, space heaters, and therapists all rolled into one furry package. Lose your dog, and you might as well dig two graves. One for him and one for your sanity. The wilderness didn't care about your loneliness, but it did make you listen differently. You learned to read the movements of the trees, to hear the mood in the wind. Every sound became a sentence. The forest spoke in whispers, and if you didn't learn the language, you didn't last long. Back east, people measured success in dollars. In the mountains, you measured it in companionship. A fire that stayed lit, a horse that didn't run off, and a dog that still wagged its tail when you said something dumb. Because when the nearest human was 100 miles away, even a grunt from a mule counted as good conversation. In the mountains, fire wasn't a luxury. It was civilization, sanity, and insurance against becoming a historical footnote. Every spark was a little miracle, and every man who made one felt like a god for about 5 minutes before it went out again. Lighting a fire in good weather was easy. Lighting one in a blizzard was a high art. You had to wrestle with frozen wood, frozen fingers, and sometimes your own frozen hope. The secret wasn't skill. It was pure, stubborn refusal to give up. You didn't make fire because you thought you could. You made it because dying was less convenient. Almond milk wasn't some modern vegan trend. It was medieval ingenuity, perfect for days when the church banned dairy. Faith and flavor had to coexist somehow. Honey sweetened nearly everything. Before sugar became common, honey was the medieval world's liquid gold. Drizzled on pastries, mixed into wine, and even smeared on meat. The result was a cuisine where sweetness crept into every corner. To the medieval tongue, a sauce wasn't complete unless it played with contrasts. Sweet and sour, hot and cold, dry and moist, the eternal balancing act of humors in edible form. Desserts, when they appeared, were theatrical. Jellies shaped like castles, pastries filled with dates and figs, and tarts decorated with nuts and spices dazzled guests who had already eaten more than humanly possible. Subtleties, as they were called, were edible sculptures. Sugar-crafted dragons, marzipan nights, and pies that released live birds when they were cut open. It wasn't just food. It was about showing off. Even the most humble cook aspired to master this flavor alchemy. Vinegar and verjuice, the sour juice of unripe grapes, added brightness to fatty dishes. Herbs from the garden, from mint to hyssop, added layers of aroma that mingled with the wood smoke. Every ladle and mortar was like a philosopher's stone in miniature, striving to turn the ordinary into something almost sacred. In the medieval kitchen, sauces and sweets blurred the line between necessity and luxury. They embodied the cook's greatest ambition, not just to feed, but to enchant. In the medieval world, eating wasn't just about satisfying your appetite. It was a moral act governed by the church. Every bite had its place in the great spiritual calendar. What you ate and when you ate it could decide whether you were pious or gluttonous, blessed or damned. The medieval year was divided not just by seasons but by fasts and feasts. Lent, the 40 days of fasting before Easter, forbade the consumption of meat, dairy, and eggs. They demanded, their voices echoing through the halls. Urbane grandeur came the inevitable reply, always and invariably his name, spoken in a chorus of tormented voices. Demons, it seemed, had remarkable consistency when it came to their accusations, pointing their collective finger at the same guilty party. The church's hierarchy began taking meticulous notes, documenting every detail of the unfolding spectacle. Reports of the possessions were sent to Richelieu's agents, who immediately recognized the potential opportunity hidden within the chaos. Grandier had publicly opposed Richelieu's policies. Now, it appeared that heaven itself was accusing him of consorting with dark forces. What better divine validation could there be for removing a political nuisance than a conveniently timed demonic scandal that was inextricably linked to his name? Meanwhile, the exorcisms grew increasingly darker and more disturbing. The nuns were subjected to hours of relentless prayer, strict fasting, and physical restraint, their bodies pushed to the very limits of endurance. Some of them fainted from sheer exhaustion, while others developed mysterious wounds that they claimed were inflicted by invisible claws, a testament to the demon's power. Physicians began to suspect that the nuns were suffering from a severe case of hysteria, but their skeptical voices were quickly drowned out by the unwavering conviction of the church, which saw each new fit as further proof of demonic possession and each agonizing scream as a sermon against the pervasive influence of sin. By the spring of 1634, Loudun had become a veritable magnet for pilgrims, gawkers, and religious zealots, all drawn to the town by the promise of witnessing the battle between good and evil. Older women became maitresses, madams, running the business with sharp tongues and even sharper minds. They handled accounts, paid guards for protection, and negotiated discreetly with city officials who pretended not to notice. Many were wealthier than the merchants who sneered at them in public. In an age when women couldn't legally own property, madams found creative ways to do so through fake names, male intermediaries, or church loopholes that were quietly ignored. For the younger women, the work was dangerous but not entirely hopeless. Some saved enough to escape the trade, marry, or open small taverns. Others succumbed to illness, violence, or exhaustion, their names recorded only in tax rolls and parish ledgers. Despite their reputation, many prostitutes were surprisingly well-connected. They heard secrets whispered by knights, priests, and clerks, secrets that could destroy reputations. Some used this knowledge as protection, others as quiet revenge. In a way, they held a power most virtuous women could never imagine. The power of knowing men as they truly were. Behind every veil and painted face was a story of survival, women who learned to navigate hypocrisy better than any bishop or baron. The church damned them, men desired them, and Paris depended on them. They were outcasts and yet somehow indispensable. When night fell over medieval Paris, its narrow streets filled with men seeking what daylight forbade. They came cloaked and hooded, muttering prayers one moment and knocking softly on shuttered doors the next. The customers of the Parisian brothels were a cross-section of medieval society, a parade of sinners united by desire. Knights fresh from battle, merchants heavy with coin, university students drunk on wine, and even the occasional monk all slipped into the city's underworld with the same guilty heartbeat. The nobility were the most predictable visitors. A knight could fight bravely by day, then spend his spoils on indulgence by night. You didn't season food to make it taste better. You seasoned it to make it last longer, to keep it from spoiling. The only spice blend they had was a mixture of desperation and soot scraped from the bottom of a cooking pot. When their supplies ran dangerously low, creativity took over, and they started experimenting with some truly questionable culinary concoctions. They ate their horses when they had to. They ate their belts. And once, in particularly dire times, they even boiled the soles of their boots to make something they called leather soup. They probably called it other things, too, most of which would be unprintable in a family-friendly environment. But let's be honest, language tends to break down a little when you're chewing on footwear. There was no farm-to-table movement in the mountains. Everything was whatever you could catch before it froze solid movement. Coffee was made from roasted chicory root, and whiskey was basically just medicine that happened to be fun to drink. Today, people meticulously count their macros and talk endlessly about clean eating and organic produce. A mountain man's diet was much simpler. If it kept you warm and alive, it was good. If it didn't, you wouldn't be around long enough to complain about it anyway. They didn't eat to live well. They ate to keep living, which in their world was already a wildly ambitious goal. When the day finally ended, or more accurately, when it became too dark to do anything else, the mountain men would gather around the only real luxury they had. A small fire that stubbornly refused to die, much like themselves. That flickering orange glow wasn't just about warmth. It was about civilization, condensed into a small circle of smoke, half-burned wood, and highly questionable storytelling. They didn't talk all that much during the day. The wind was usually too loud, the work was too demanding, and language was mostly reduced to a series of grunts, curses, and urgent commands. They carried flint and steel like holy objects. Some kept a coal burning in bark or moss, tucked against their chest through miles of snow. Losing it meant a night of regret and possibly self-cremation. Wet wood was nature's way of giving you the middle finger. You'd curse, shave bark, and blow until your lungs gave out before your fire did. When it finally caught, that first flicker of light was sacred. Not just in a metaphorical way, but truly sacred. You didn't look away. You didn't move. You stared at it like it was an old friend who'd come back from the dead. A good fire wasn't just heat. It was company, comfort, and a way to keep from going completely nuts all in one blazing package. The fire demanded respect. Too small and it made fun of you. Too big and it tried to kill you. You learned to read the flames like emotions. A hiss meant damp wood. Pop meant success. A sudden whoosh meant you just burned your only pair of gloves. Fire turned food into something you could actually eat, fear into something you could manage, and nights into something you could survive. It was a teacher, too. Get lazy and it vanished. Get careless and it punished you. Fire didn't forgive. It just burned. Every mountain man had his own little ritual. Some whispered to it. Others fed it like it was alive because, in a way, it was the only thing in that frozen world that actually was. When you sat beside it, your back freezing and your face burning, you remembered just how delicate warmth really was. Civilization began with fire. Out here, it also ended with it. The mountain men didn't have thermostats. They had survival. And somewhere along the line, we traded one for the other. We forgot that warmth used to mean effort. That staying alive took more than just remembering to pay the utility bill. They weren't afraid of discomfort. They negotiated with it. The cold taught them patience, humility, and how to build toughness one frozen mistake at a time. Advent had similar restrictions. Fridays were fish days, a rule that still faintly echoes today. The logic was spiritual but also practical. By limiting meat, the church conserved livestock and stretched scarce resources. But for cooks, these restrictions were both a nightmare and a creative challenge. Fish became the savior of the fasting table. Rivers, lakes, and coasts teemed with herring, eel, and cod, though. By the time it reached the inner continent, the fish might have traveled for weeks, salted to near immortality. In monasteries, inventive cooks found ways to turn fasting meals into gourmet puzzles. They crafted mock meats, fish molded into the shape of roast birds, or almond milk made to resemble cream. In wealthy homes, fasting was an excuse to flaunt their wealth by serving exotic sea creatures like sturgeon or porpoise, which were considered suitable for Lent because they lived in the water. Religion didn't just shape what was forbidden. It blessed what was allowed. Feast days unleashed abundance. Roasted oxen, honeyed breads, and rivers of ale marked holy celebrations. Cooking for a saint's day or a wedding feast was a sacred duty, an act of devotion as much as indulgence. Even the timing of meals was considered sacred, ordained by a higher power. Monks, in their monastic lives, partook of their sustenance in complete silence, a hush amplified by the sonorous readings of scriptures. This practice transformed the simple act of dining into a form of moving meditation. The peasantry, conversely, offered prayers of thanks before each meal, often setting aside a humble portion of bread as an offering to the spirits or a gesture of charity toward the impoverished. They were acutely aware that hunger was a constant, lurking presence in their lives. In essence, medieval cuisine was not merely about satiating hunger, but was deeply entwined with religious devotion. The town's faith had curdled into an unhealthy obsession, a morbid fascination with the dark forces at play, and far away, Father Grandier could already feel the tightening noose of suspicion and condemnation closing around his soul and his neck, threatening to choke the life out of him. By the time Father Urbain Grandier was finally arrested in 1634, his guilt had already been preordained in the eyes of the Church. The Church didn't need tangible proof. It had the captivating drama of the possessed nuns, whose constant accusations had painted him as the devil's puppet. The priests leading the exorcisms claimed to have extracted signed pacts between Grandier and the devil himself, written in crude Latin and sealed with human blood, binding him to the forces of darkness. The documents were laughably crude and transparently fake, filled with the signatures of well-known demons like Lucifer, Leviathan, and even Beelzebub, as if hell possessed a formal registry of its unholy members. But in 17th century France, cold hard logic was conspicuously absent from the courtroom, replaced by superstition and fear. Grandier was dragged through the streets in chains, subjected to the jeers and taunts of the same townspeople who had once admired his wit and eloquence in his sermons. He maintained his composure, steadfastly insisting that he was innocent, a victim of slander, jealousy, and political machinations disguised as religious piety. His voice a lone beacon of reason in a sea of madness. But Richelieu's agents had already sensed an opportunity to exploit the situation for their own political gain. The trial became more than just a question of faith. It was a chance to crush a vocal critic of the crown and silence any dissent that might threaten the established order. The machinery of the church and the state worked together with frightening efficiency, weaving a web of lies and accusations that was impossible for Grandier to escape. Chivalry demanded that he honor women, but only certain kinds. Courtesans were safe sin, neither wives nor virgins, existing to absorb the lust that polite society denied. Many knights developed favorite houses where their gold ensured discretion and familiarity. Some even treated the women as confidants, whispering gossip about noble feuds or military campaigns between kisses. Merchants, too, were frequent patrons. Prosperous men from the markets of Les Halles or the docks of the Seine often sought relaxation after counting coins all day. Brothels near the river did brisk business, where wine flowed freely and conversation mixed easily with commerce. Deals were sealed over embraces, debts forgiven over laughter. For the merchant class, pleasure was another kind of transaction, one they could afford. But the most controversial visitors were the clergy. Priests and friars sworn to chastity were often among the most loyal clients. Some came in disguise, others openly, claiming spiritual guidance for the women. The hypocrisy was no secret. Even chroniclers joked that half the city's holy men kept private ministries in tavern backrooms. Yet the church turned a blind eye, preferring sin behind closed doors to scandal in the streets. The brothel was a strange equalizer. A nobleman and a beggar might share the same wine jug or the same woman, both shedding their identities for a few hours of anonymity. When morning came, they'd vanish into the city's mist, each pretending the night had never happened. In medieval Paris, sin was democratic. Every man, regardless of title or robe, walked those alleys eventually, and every one of them paid the same price: silver for pleasure and silence for survival. Officially, the Church of medieval Paris thundered from the pulpit that lust was the gateway to hell. Unofficially, it managed the traffic. The same institution that condemned brothels also taxed them, inspected them, and quietly ensured their survival. But at night, when the snow hissed and whispered just outside the fire's reach, word started to crawl out, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence. That's when you heard the philosophy of men who'd seen far too much cold and not nearly enough kindness in their lives. They'd sit hunched under their furs, their beards stiff with frost, staring into the dancing flames as if the fire owed them some kind of explanation for the universe's cruelty. One man would mumble something like, "Ain't nothing colder than regret," and another would nod in solemn agreement, not because it made any logical sense, but because everything seemed to make perfect sense after the third or fourth sip of whiskey. The firelight had a way of turning trappers into thinkers, even if just for a little while. Every crackle was a sermon, every spark a poignant reminder that warmth was fleeting and temporary. They'd talk about the things that truly mattered to them: women, whiskey, and the weather, and how all three could potentially kill you if you underestimated their power. Sometimes, though, the silence would take over, blanketing the small circle of warmth. Not the comfortable kind of silence, but the kind that pressed against your ribs, that made you acutely aware of just how utterly alone you really were out there in the wilderness. The fire became a companion, a silent witness, and in some ways a confessional. It didn't judge, it didn't interrupt, and it always burned out just when you needed it most, forcing you to face the cold and the darkness on your own once again. Every man had their own unique fire ritual, their own way of relating to the flames. Some would poke at it obsessively, as if keeping the fire alive was proof that they themselves could still cheat death. Others would sit perfectly still, mesmerized by the flickering light, staring into the flames as if they were gazing at the last remaining piece of warmth left in the entire world. We've replaced that with electric blankets and inspirational quotes about getting out of your comfort zone, usually said by people sitting comfortably indoors. They knew the cold wasn't an enemy. It was a teacher that graded harshly, and failing meant ending up in a shallow grave. But the lesson stuck. You learned to respect nature because it didn't give a damn about your excuses. These men could predict a blizzard by the way the air smelled. Most people today need a weather app to find their own mailbox. The church exerted its influence over the menu, shaping dietary habits with as much authority as the changing seasons. Each loaf of bread and every spoonful of stew served as a tangible reminder that food was both a divine gift and a potential source of temptation, serving as nourishment for the body while simultaneously testing the strength and purity of the soul. Before the advent of sophisticated ovens, the hearth reigned supreme as the primary source of cooking. It was a demanding teacher, imparting lessons in patience and the art of improvisation. The tools found in a medieval kitchen were deceptively simple in design yet remarkably ingenious in their functionality. These tools were crafted for a world devoid of timers, thermometers, and precise temperature control. Heavy iron cauldrons, suspended from chains, loomed over open flames, their contents simmering for countless hours as cooks meticulously adjusted the intensity of the fire by adding or subtracting handfuls of wood. The hearth was much more than just a cooking surface. It was a veritable battleground where smoke, ash, and flame waged a constant war for dominance. The cooking tools themselves often resembled instruments of war rather than implements of culinary creation. Substantial spits were employed to rotate entire animal carcasses, either manually or with the assistance of turnspit dogs. These were small, long-bodied canines specifically bred and trained to run on treadmills, which in turn rotated the meat over the fire. Skillets, pans, and ladles were forged from such heavy iron that they could easily double as defensive weapons during a kitchen brawl, which, given the high-stress environment, was always a distinct possibility. Knives were ubiquitous, readily available for a variety of tasks, but forks were conspicuously absent. Witnesses came forward in droves, servants, exorcists, and even the nuns themselves, each one eager to prove their unwavering loyalty to God or, more likely, to save their own skin from the wrath of the authorities. Their testimonies bordered on the absurd, painting Grandier as a figure of almost supernatural evil. They claimed that he had flown through the convent windows in the dead of night, that he had sent demons in the form of black cats to torment the nuns, and that his very breath possessed the power to corrupt virgin souls, turning innocence into sin. The courtroom, packed with spectators eager to witness the spectacle, lapped it all up, reveling in the unfolding drama. The trial was equal parts sermon, theatrical spectacle, and witch hunt, a dangerous cocktail of faith and fear. When the judges presented the so-called demonic contract as evidence, Grandier couldn't help but laugh, a fatal mistake that would seal his doom. His mockery was immediately painted as arrogance, his confidence as the devil's pride, further solidifying his image as a servant of darkness. He was subjected to days of brutal torture in an attempt to extract a confession, his legs crushed between heavy wooden boards as the priests relentlessly demanded repentance, seeking to break his spirit and force him to admit to his supposed crimes. Yet, even in the midst of unimaginable agony, he stubbornly refused to confess to witchcraft, maintaining his innocence to the very end. "I am guilty only," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "of having offended powerful men." But reason and justice had no place in Loudun anymore. The verdict was predetermined, the execution date was set, and the priest who had once stood in the pulpit preaching salvation was now condemned as the devil's very mouthpiece, a symbol of the evil that needed to be purged from the town. To the moral eye, prostitution was sin. To the practical one, it was a civic necessity. And few organizations in history have been as skilled at balancing holiness with hypocrisy as the medieval church. The logic was delightfully twisted. Church authorities claimed brothels were a lesser evil, a way to prevent greater sins like adultery, rape, and sodomy. A controlled outlet, they argued, kept men from corrupting respectable women. Thus, the trade of sin became, in the church's eyes, a form of moral plumbing, diverting lust away from the sacred and toward the expendable. Brothels weren't blessed, but they were tolerated, managed, and crucially, taxed. Records from the 13th and 14th centuries show that Parisian clergy collected rent from houses of ill repute, often through intermediaries to maintain plausible deniability. Some convents even owned properties later leased to madams, a convenient arrangement where holy funds and sinful profits mixed seamlessly. The bishop's office, meanwhile, ensured the women were registered and examined for cleanliness, not out of compassion, but to maintain public order and prevent disease outbreaks among wealthy clients. The papacy periodically condemned this hypocrisy, but only when politically convenient. In 1254, King Louis IX tried to abolish brothels altogether, calling them an affront to Christian virtue. Within a year, they quietly reopened, this time under new management, often municipal officials working in cooperation with church wardens. The king may have worn a halo, but the tax collectors knew where salvation really came from. Confession also played its part in this double game. A priest might hear a man's sins on Sunday, then accept a discreet donation on Monday from the same establishment that caused them. Redemption, it turned out, was available for a modest fee, payable in coin, not repentance. The church may have claimed to guard the gates of heaven, but in medieval Paris it also leased rooms on the road to hell. When the fork finally did make its appearance, it was vehemently condemned by some priests as a diabolical prong, an unnecessary and vain replacement for the fingers that God had so graciously bestowed upon humankind. Bread ovens, when available, were typically communal resources. In many villages, a single massive oven served the entire community. Each household carefully marked their loaves with a unique personal symbol to ensure proper identification after baking. Timing was of paramount importance. Too early, and the oven would be excessively hot, resulting in burnt bread. Too late, and the bread would turn to charcoal. Cooks, through years of experience, learned to discern the oven's temperature with the same intuitive skill that sailors used to read the wind, relying on a combination of sight, smell, and instinct. Water was drawn by hand from wells or streams, salt was a precious and highly valued commodity, and the concept of impeccably clean surfaces was, to put it mildly, rather generous. The kitchen dog often performed the pre-wash cycle by diligently licking dishes clean, and hands were rinsed in shared bowls both before and after meals. Yet, despite the ever-present grime and smoke, a sense of pride permeated these tools. They served as a tangible connection to a long lineage of survival, linking the cook to generations past. Faith permeated even the most mundane of utensils. Crosses were meticulously etched into the surface of bread before baking as a protective measure against evil spirits. Knives were ritually blessed before being used for slaughter. The hearth itself was sometimes sprinkled with holy water on designated feast days. Every clang of iron against iron and every crackle of the fire told the same enduring story. Cooking was an act of labor, devotion, and unwavering endurance. The tools of the medieval kitchen were not mere instruments. They were revered relics of human resilience, forged in the crucible of heat, faith, and hunger. Loudun had found its scapegoat, and France had secured its supposed holy victory, sacrificing an innocent man to appease the masses and solidify its own power. On August 18, 1634, the town of Loudun gathered to witness what was billed as a divine victory over the forces of darkness, the public burning of Father Urbain Grandier. The town square had been transformed into a stage for this macabre spectacle, a setting designed to instill fear and reaffirm the power of the church. Soldiers stood guard, maintaining order among the swelling crowd, while priests led the assembled masses in hymns, their voices echoing through the square. Merchants capitalized on the occasion, selling food and drink to the throngs of people who had come from miles around to witness the execution. Everyone wanted to see the devil's servant meet his fiery end, believing that it would bring peace and purification to their town. The cruel irony, of course, was that the only fire born of hell that day was the one lit by human hands, fueled by hatred, fear, and religious fanaticism. Its sermons damned lust, yet its ledgers depended on it, and no one dared call it blasphemy, because everyone was profiting.